Well, really, it's a humiliating story, but that's okay because I still laugh about it today. I was at I was feeling really good about where I was in my career. I was leading a large diversity effort for Macy's department store. I actually developed the diversity effort, and it was a big initiative. And I was feeling really good about myself, right? And I'd just been promoted, and I had built the diversity program on the notion of being accepting of a wide variety of people. And so as the head of diversity, I believed I was very accepting of a wide variety of people. I was on my way to go do a panel discussion, and I was one of the featured speakers. Again, I was feeling really good about myself. And as was back in the day, I was wearing a suit, and I had a skirt on, and I had my laptop bag, and, I was walking along in my high heels, and I went through a park on my way to this panel discussion, again, feeling very, really proud of myself, frankly. And a man who was sitting on a bench, as I passed by him, said, "Hey." And I was, a little startled, and I thought, I don't know what he wants, but I'm going to ignore him. And he said, "Hey." And I thought, no, 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 no. But then eventually I kind of turned around and I said, "What?" And he said, "Your skirt's hiked up in the back." And I thought, for all of my belief that I was this accepting of a wide variety of people, right? It brought me right back down to this very humble place where you got to listen to everybody around you. And so even this man in the park who was just trying to help me, to this day, again, very humbling experience, took me right down off of the high horse that I was riding to that panel discussion.
Question is, how did the panel go?
I think it went okay because I had been humbled, right? And so you tend, under those circumstances, when your ego takes a little bruising, it's usually your best work, honestly. So I don't remember specifically, but I would guess that it probably went better as a result of that moment.
Amazing. I'm just curious, though, how hiked up was it in the
It
back?
was really, Karen, it was really hiked up. It was, that part was humbling as well. I got to be honest.
That's always like the worst nightmare, coming out of the bathroom or walking in public.
No, I know. And here I was in the middle of a park. It was broad daylight. Like, why I didn't turn around immediately as this man is trying to help me. But anyway, that may be the last time I carried a computer bag, too. The combo of having it hike up my skirt. Yeah, really embarrassing.
Hello and welcome to Skilled,
The podcast where we speak with remarkable L&D and HR leaders to hear the stories behind the strategies and skills that drive measurable success. I'm Karen Rosenfeld here with Omer Glass, GrowthSpace's CEO, and today's guest is Ann Lazarus-Barnes. Ann has over 35 years of HR experience across technology, finance, and retail. She is currently the Chief People Officer at Lionbridge, where she oversees human capital programs that align with the company's strategic goals. Ann has held leadership roles at Convergys, Fifth Third Bank, and Macy's, and is the recipient of the National Retail Federation Silver Award and Ohio's Glass Ceiling Award for advancing women in the workplace. Hello and welcome, Ann.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Well, we're so grateful you're here. Just as a reference point, Ann was very ill last week and we had to reschedule, so I'm happy you're healthy. That's the most important. Humility and health, those are maybe those are
That's a theme for the day.
That's the thread, yes. So let's turn to your wins, your successes. I mean, obviously you have a robust background in diversity, inclusion, and women in leadership roles. I'm curious if your sort of proudest successful moments come out of there, or you're going to throw us a curveball and it's something else you want to share.
Yeah, I'll throw you a little bit of a curveball, although it is related to diversity and the diversity of how people prefer to get things done. And what I mean by that is I was given responsibility for a very specific team. And the reason it just sticks out for me as being a really successful development initiative for me related to a very specific team. But this team was really dysfunctional. And, you can read 5 dysfunctions of a team. You can read lots and lots of information about why teams are dysfunctional. but I had to figure out how do I go about figuring out what is really the dysfunction of the team. Some of the team was saying that it was diversity related, right? Like some of the women were saying they were being discounted. Some of the race-based minorities were saying they weren't being heard. Different people had different reasons why they believe that the team was dysfunctional and why they as individuals didn't feel comfortable on this team. And what I ended up doing was I used a tool to help the team explore their individual preferences on how to get things done. And what I mean by a preference, I believe, and it's a particular tool that I use. Most people prefer to operate either in what I'll call kind of a logic quadrant, a vision quadrant, a relationship quadrant, or a process quadrant. And a team that's really doing well and kind of humming along and getting a lot done, typically you've got all of those preferences represented on the team, and you also have a great deal of respect for each of the other preferences and what they bring to the team itself. And so what I ended up doing was sending this team first through self-discovery to figure out where are their preferences. And then we got together to talk about the individual preferences and the power that those preferences were going to bring to the whole team. So if the team were only made up of people that wanted to think logically, finance, then they're missing the benefit of somebody who might be more relationship driven, right? If somebody only wants to think about process, then they may be missing the benefit of having somebody whose preferred area to operate is really more in that supervisionary quadrant. So we did a lot of work, or I did a lot of work with the individuals. Then we did a lot of work as a team. Ultimately, the team was missing a whole component of kind of this relationship driven. Again, it was a technology team. And to this day, first of all, they launched a super successful product, and they would attribute some of that to the way they were getting along as a team and really respecting the differences on the team. They also recognized they had a gap, that no one represented sort of this idea of relationship. I happen to be really relationship driven. So for me, it was anathema that you didn't have somebody on the team that was relationship driven. But what they realized was the product that they were delivering really required the capability of understanding someone who was coming from that relationship quadrant. So they would get together as a team and actually reserve a chair for that aspect which they lacked on the team. And they also believe that that was part of the success of the product that they launched. So that's one example. You know, I am an executive coach. I certainly have had success with individuals who were earlier in their career and then bringing them along, or as even CEOs and being able to coach a CEO. You know, I get a great deal of satisfaction out of that. But I would say my success in terms of talent development, definitely around team dynamics and particularly a dysfunctional team.
I have a question. And do you think it's about understanding the situation and perception, or it's about building skills? Because sometimes you say, okay, so like let's take your finance example. Sometimes they need to just learn the skills of communication, right? And sometimes it's just like a switch in perception. So what do you think would be the most like common?
I think it's both, but I will say that communication is one of the bigger areas where if you figure out where you are between and among these four quadrants that I talked about, you will have much better success. For instance, sending an email, and this is a very real example. If I know I'm going to send an email to somebody, a CFO, who I believe to be very logic driven, I'm probably not going to start my email, although I'm relationship driven, with, hey, hope you had a great weekend. I'm probably going to start with some very logical framing of whatever my email is about. It isn't to say that the CFO doesn't have an interest or doesn't want to answer a question about how was your weekend, but I know that the way that I'm going to want to approach someone, if I know where they prefer to operate, it's going to go much more smoothly, and it's going to be more accepted by that person. Right. I'll give you another example. I had developed a really thorough presentation about diversity at Macy's, and it was probably, I don't know, a day-long education that I was putting together, and I was launching it in front of other diversity professionals at Macy's, and we finished, and I again, real sense of accomplishment, a lot of content, really great stuff. And I stopped and I said, "What does everyone think?" And somebody toward the back of the room raised their hand and they said, "You don't have any slide numbers on your deck." And I was, and I, this time I was humble enough that I sat back and I was like, you know what? You're right. And for everybody that prefers process and really the detail of process, that miss of not having slide numbers was enough to make that person really uncomfortable with my presentation. They couldn't even listen to the content. So again, super helpful to know either who's in the audience, who you're about to communicate to, who you're working on a team with. I think there's an awful lot where preference is concerned. And to your point, the idea of being able to flex and adapt to where that person is, so you're much more receiver centered, I think makes a big difference as well.
Yeah, and to put it in my words, it's basically a skill, right? Because you communicate to different people, so you need to learn that skill. So coming back to that example, okay, so you had these 4 quadrants. You told them some of your relationship driven, some of your logic driven, and so forth. How did you teach them, basically? Like how? Okay, so you had an upskilling problem, basically, because if everyone, like the team, wasn't functioning because they weren't communicating to each other like in a proper way, so they had friction, and this is super common. Like Karen and I just came off a call exactly on that topic between like two functions disagreeing on something that for me is super basic, but in order to resolve that, like they both of them need to communicate better, like both sides, right? And that's how you resolve it. So how did you go about, again, the specific upskilling task? How did you teach them to do? Because for you it's intuitive, you know that, but
Yeah,
you're
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a great question. And it really, again, it starts with the individual and the self-discovery and the willingness to listen to. By the way, there's no better preference than another. That's the other piece of this, right? So I think when you approach individuals and say, we want everyone to be logical in terms of their approach. That's then to say that the other preferences are not as valued. So the first thing was being able to say to everybody, we all can operate in all of these quadrants. We all have the capability of operating in them. It's the degree to which you prefer to do it. And so it kind of takes the sting out of it. I am who I am, and this is where I prefer to be. The one thing that we didn't do though was just say, well, oh well, that's just Anne. That's where she operates. It was more an understanding of what do the other quadrants bring to you if your preference is in one quadrant, right? What is the benefit of listening to someone who might be more vision oriented or more process oriented or more relationship oriented or more logic oriented? And again, I give you the example of the slide numbering. Like that is so far from anything that I care about, and I absolutely don't prefer to be in the processing part of the quadrant, but it was actually really important. And as a result of, and that's a small example, but as a result of that, it was better. And so it is a matter of sitting with the team and saying the best team has all 4 quadrants really strongly represented.
And also, I would argue there needs to be a recognition that not everyone thinks like you and not everyone operates
Yes.
like you, and that's okay. But you need to put yourself in their shoes a little bit so you can understand how best to do that. I think then, especially for people who are good with the relationships, that's intuitive. But for someone who's very process oriented, that might not be the case. So
Yeah.
I'm assuming that would probably, I think for a lot of people, that's a huge leap to make. Like, oh wait, not everyone thinks like this. Oh, I have to like make accommodation.
We did ultimately end up that most of the conflict was around these preferences. It wasn't gender, and it wasn't race, and it wasn't things that I think as humans, when you can't figure out why isn't this working out so well, right? You tend to go to things that the dimensions of diversity that you can't change, thinking, well, that must be what it is, right? That it was that dysfunctional on the team, by the way. So when we were able to bring it up to preferences, then people were like, oh, okay, I get it. So my my interest in ensuring that we have an agenda at every meeting is driving the person with vision absolutely insane. But that's a conflict, but that's okay. It doesn't mean that we need to do without the agenda. It just means that the vision person has to dip into their processing quadrant and be able to say, oh, yes, the agenda keeps us on task. It's really valuing the other individual, right? And the other approach.
So now I think it's a very good example of just one very specific incident among a team. Like you have basically a business problem with a team, and you understand the source, the core of the problem, because again, it wasn't race, it wasn't gender, it wasn't diversity, it was how people communicate, right? And communication styles. And then there comes the question of, okay, this was a team of how many people?
I think there were 15 in total.
Okay, so 15. How do you, as an HR leader who leads now HR in a 5,000 people organization, how do you do that at scale? Because you have these problems in every team, in every 15 people, in every 5 people. So I think that's maybe one of the biggest questions in general for HR professionals. How do you do the same thing that you did here, but you do it systematically? So you always identify the problem, identify the need, tailor a solution, the right solution, and how you do it for 5,000 people, 800
Yeah,
managers. It's
it's a
big.
it's a really good question. And first of all, I have a team of people that I rely on as well that are so I am not personally managing all. We have 6,000 employees in 27 countries, speaking multiple languages. So we do have local HR teams who are real professionals. But I know for me, in terms of the teams that I come into contact with, and particularly conflict, I will always go back to this example for me personally, right? Because it was such a success and I've used it in enough different situations, mostly conflict situations, believe it or not, because it again, it very easily explains where from where the conflict grew. And so I tend to rely on it situationally, to your point. So, how do I scale something like this? I probably don't, to be very frank. Right? I rely on either the teams to work together, my team to work with other teams. I wait for something to escalate. That's always an option. I will also have different teams reach out and say, you know what, we're doing okay, but we believe that we can probably be better. What kind of tools would you recommend? So we'll work with teams again situationally. It's a great question though. There aren't enough HR people.
So basically, what you're saying is that it's kind of like the 80-20. I cannot solve for everything, but I can identify the burning needs because those are the needs that are being escalated. And then I can tailor a solution per need, but it's in a much smaller scale. But then again, the unknown is what you do not know, and problems that are there and people just do not talk about because there are many problems. That's a nice thing about humans, right? Like that's basically the other side of the coin is that humans have a hard time working with each other. That's fair.
Yeah, we don't have the we're Lionbridge is a really unique place. We of course we whenever you get a group of human beings together, you're probably going to have some conflict. We generally are an incredibly collaborative group of people. There's something in our world. We do translation services. We tend to attract a group of employees that are very altruistic. They love the idea of communication. They love the idea of getting our clients' products, goods, and services to their customers. There's something very unique in our culture. So, either because of or despite the fact that we have 6,000 employees, the number of negative conflicts, and I think that's a difference too in this particular dysfunctional team. It was a really negative experience. Most of the time, what I find is teams are kind of humming along and they figured this out on their own, right? And they're able to really value the individual, whatever they bring to the particular team.
Amazing. No, I think that's fair. And then if you add my next question before we move on, adding the sort of global layer, and I'm assuming remote locations and all that can only sort of compound conflict. I'm wondering, how do you address that if there are issues where you have two different offices or individuals from different locations having issues? How do you navigate those waters?
Yeah, I really, and again, I don't want to, we're a super unique company, and I get that. There, because of the nature of what we do, where we rely on diversity of language, is right. It comes very naturally for us. We employ a lot of really global citizens, and so the kind of not normal, but the experience that I've had in other companies that don't value the diversity of the globe doesn't exist in our company, because we've always been global and we've always relied on this diversity for revenue, right? So I'm in a really enviable position in that regard. But I certainly have worked for companies where, and I work for a BPO, a very successful BPO that relied heavily on offshoring. And under those circumstances, there was a kind of them and us feeling to some of the work that was being done. And at that point, I didn't really work with the teams that were experiencing that, but I can remember just the language that people were using to reference individuals that were working in some of the offshore locations. They didn't sound as though they were really valuing those employees as much. I wouldn't have stood for it if I were the head of HR, but I wasn't. So I stuck with my teams.
Oh, that's great. At least that. So let's quickly talk about the sort of less successful endeavors you've undertaken. Is there anything that sort of stands out? And I really want to focus also on what you've learned, because a lot of times, unfortunately or fortunately, we learn a lot from our failures or missteps, a lot more than our successes even.
Yeah. Um, I think the biggest failure that I've had, I had a great deal of success launching, again, a diversity initiative um, for Macy's. And it was one of the very first in the United States. And it was core to that company. And I led it for a number of years. And I was wooed away to a financial institution to basically do the same thing. And, again, I was feeling, well, of course, like here's my playbook. This is going to work great. But what I and it was not great. I was countercultural to this very conservative financial institution. And try as I might to follow my playbook, it just wasn't catching, right? It wasn't part of their normal culture. I started feeling a little bit like I was a check the box, like, oh yeah, we've got somebody that leads diversity. She sits over there. Um, and they had a lot of really great things about their culture, but what I learned, so fast forward, I ended up leaving that company. I actually, my position was eliminated, which had never happened in my career ever. I was a single mom. Like, it was not a good situation. Now, as it turned out, it gave me an opportunity to reevaluate where I wanted to spend my time. Did I want to do another stint in diversity, or did I want to go become more of a generalist, which I did become more of a generalist? Great story from there on out. But it was devastating, because it was a failure of my playbook that had worked really well in a Fortune 50 company, and suddenly wasn't working well in this particular financial institution. And what I learned was that culture trumps everything, absolutely everything. And that if you are trying to launch an initiative, HR or otherwise, if you are trying to launch an initiative that is either countercultural or uncomfortable for the culture, or somehow doesn't fit with a given culture, you will not have success the way you may have experienced it somewhere else. And it was hugely disappointing, because I had worked really hard. And diversity is one of those topics you got to believe it, right? Like there is a righteousness to diversity. And so the fact that I wasn't successful and that they could eliminate my role, again, just completely devastating. So again, what I learned was that culture trumps everything. I also realized that culture was really important to me professionally. I had never really paid that much attention to it because I'd been fortunate to end up in cultures that fit up until that point. And then I hit this culture where I was just constantly arguing the point about diversity and trying different, well, let's try the business aspect, let's try the human aspect, let's try let's try all these different ways of selling diversity, and then never really being successful at it. So that is what I learned. And again, hard to have your job eliminated, but it was that moment when I decided, let me take a turn off of the diversity train and become that generalist, that then allowed me to become the chief people officer ultimately, where I am now.
So I think I really like two things in what you just said. The first thing is that it's sometimes we're in a harsh situations, like unpleasant, you're single mom, like the role got eliminated and it seems like the worst thing in the world. And then eventually things unfold in a way that kind of like, deterministically they should have unfold, or it taught you the right things about it's not, it's as valuable to understand what you like as you understand what you do not like. And I think eventually it pushed you out of like a company that basically wasn't the right fit and actually out of a role. And then your career evolved and you found yourself as a CEO. So I think it's a very positive notion, and it's very important to remember like that sometimes, I don't know, like the company is cutting us or something like that, but maybe I can do something else, and eventually it will unfold in a much more positive way. And I will talk in a podcast 10 years later about this incident. I think that's yeah, it's a very important optimistic thing to remember. Yeah, sorry.
It's really interesting that you say that, because unfortunately, job eliminations are a regular part of doing business. As you evolve as a company, maybe you've set up a group that no longer, fits with the direction of the company, whatever. But whenever I talk to someone personally about your role is being eliminated, first of all, I'm incredibly empathetic because I've been there. Secondly, I always tell them, I have been where you are, and I know how difficult this news is to hear. And not that softens the blow, but misery loves company, right? So better to know the person that's doing this horrible elimination. I also always say to them, you may not believe me, but most of the time when a role is eliminated and we release somebody to go do something else, they will come back to me 6 months, a year later, and say, that was the best thing that ever happened to me. Like it is this pivotal moment that you can't understand it, but it does release you to go do other things. And most people come back saying, I don't love that you had to do it, but I actually ended up in a much better place. And I say that depending upon how the conversation's going, I usually share that with people, and people will call me later, again, 6 months, a year later, and say, you know what, you were right. You're right. I'm way better off. I'm so much happier. I'm now, sometimes they go take up a completely different professional life. Sometimes it was a matter of getting them a little, a little bit more energized about what they wanted to do next, or go back to, a couple of people have gone back to school. Like there are some really great stories out there, but yes, it was difficult at the time, but it was a pivotal moment for me professionally as well as personally. Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, 100%. And the second thing that I really liked about what you said, just to give that line of thought, was that you never assume anything. Like the fact that you had the one playbook that worked will not say, not only because of culture, because of so many reasons. Sometimes it may work because you had the right executive sponsor. Sometimes it will work because it was a really business need. So you cannot really do this copy paste. and you always need to kind of like experiment. You may have a good idea how to start, but you do not know how it will end. So like start and test and pivot and test, and not kind of like come with a playbook. Hey, that's the playbook, because it will usually not work.
Yeah, yeah. It usually doesn't work. You're absolutely right. I think that there is a secret sauce to every company. And some people talk about LL Bean and their customer service, right? For Macy's, where I had originally launched the diversity effort, there was a whole history of valuing women. It was the first organization to give a credit card to women in the United States. It was the first one to employ African Americans as full associates. It was the first. So there was a whole history of diversity that I had nothing to do with, right? But it was sort of founded on the concepts of diversity anyway. The diversity of the customer base. Some of the first department stores went into different neighborhoods where department stores had not typically gone were Macy's. So of course, I thought it was my initiative and my playbook. It wasn't. There was this whole history behind. And to assume that that secret sauce was going to exist somewhere else was, it was a little foolish on my part. I did also learn sense of humor is really important to me in a culture. But Macy's executives, associates, they have a sense of theatrics and sense of humor that is really unique. The bank, not so much. And I realized, again, that was another moment where I was like, you know what? I really want to go somewhere where people like find things not ha funny, but can see the humor in things. Because frankly, not every day is a great day in business, but you might as well enjoy it while you're there.
Or don't take themselves too seriously, at least.
Yes.
Which is a common flaw, no offense to the financial industry. I'm hearing, for me, my through lines for you, it's really this balance of humility and humor is sort of like maybe your mantra of how you go about doing things. But and so maybe this is the perfect time to sort of look back and say, if you could give yourself some piece of advice or tell yourself what to focus on, what skills you should value when you were first starting out as an HR leader, what would you tell yourself?
Yeah. I think the first thing I would tell myself is just relax. Like I was really hard driving. And again, I also had the pressure of single motherhood. There was a lot going on personally that I was super driven. But when first starting as the leader of HR, as the chief people officer, I think the first thing is listen a lot. Don't be quick to act. In fact, one of the things I've learned is that the people who darken your doorway first when you start as the chief people officer are typically not the priority. They just happen to be the most brave to walk into your office. I spent a significant amount of time my first year at Lionbridge on some like Swiss bonus program because somebody had me all rattled that it had to be solved or it was going to be really bad. Looking back on it, that was like the last thing I should have been spending time on. But I was so oriented toward action and so oriented toward getting something done that I thought was important because this person who was a senior executive said it was really important. Anyway, you really want to spend a lot of time listening and kind of relaxing into the fact that you've got a great background that you can rely on, and your intuition and your instincts are going to tell you. You got to trust those really well as you're listening, and doing kind of the listening tour around the company, and not be quite so quick to act. Again, that was a lesson that I learned. The Swiss bonus program, right? Because rarely are the first things that you want to act on because somebody told you it's important are the real priority.
Amazing. Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us. I have learned a lot and have also thought about the fact that I too have walked around with computer bags that did awful things to skirts, which is probably why I only wear pants now.
Right.
Or
right.
dresses. It's like I leaned away from the skirt.
Or stay
Sorry,
home.
Omar, you
Stay home.
and listen, I have the privilege of working from home almost every day, and nobody cares about my wardrobe. It's great.
Yeah, yeah. That
They
was
just care
again
about the
humbling
work.
experience, and
Like,
I still you got to laugh at those moments, and we've all had some version of what I described. I'm just brave enough to talk about it out loud. So, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it.
thank you for your humor, bravery, and humility, and we really appreciate your time.
Great. Thank you.